Psychology Assignment 4 Screencast by Charlie Taylor. So first of all, we're going to go through what arousal actually is. My definition is that arousal is the state of being mentally and physically alert and ready and attentive. The textbook definition is arousal is the state of alertness and anticipation that prepares the body for action. The arousal levels for an athlete can change from a low level to an optimum level and then can also go into a high level of arousal. So depending on what level of arousal the athlete is at, their concentration and attention span can be affected in a match or a game. For example, if an athlete had a high level of arousal, they would have a narrow or small attention span. An example of this could be for a winger in a football match. They may be so focused on receiving the ball from their teammate that they didn't notice that they are off the pitch. Therefore, when they receive the ball, the ref would call it as a throwing to the opponents. This would have a negative impact on the athlete's performance, as it is more likely for them to lose possession of the ball and make it easier for the other team to gain possession. If an athlete had a low arousal level, it would mean that they would have a more broad attention span. For example, a basketball player may be in a phase of low arousal and may accidentally pass the ball to an opponent, thinking that it was one of their own teammates. This is due to them not being focused on the match and are not taking a lot of key information needed for the match. Instead, they are looking round at their surroundings, such as a loud crowd, rather than focusing on the game. This would have a negative impact on the athlete's performance because they aren't fully aware of what's going on in the match, meaning that it is more likely that they would lose the ball, which could lead to the other team scoring and maybe winning the game. The best level of arousal for an athlete to be at is optimum level of arousal. If they had this level when doing a sport, they would be more focused on the game. For example, a long distance runner, such as a 10,000 meter runner, would have an optimal arousal level when they start the race and also during the race. This is so that the atmosphere around them doesn't affect their performance. They are able to shift all their attention onto the race and the pace that they are running at and focused on winning. This will have a positive effect on the athlete's performance because they are able to be in the zone, which would mean that they are less likely to get distracted, and because of this they would have a better chance of winning the race. So the theories that we're going to go through is Holds drive theory, inverted U hypothesis, and the catastrophe theory. The first theory I'm going to go through is called the Holds drive theory. This theory shows that the relationship between the arousal of an athlete and their performance. The graph which is used for this theory shows that as arousal increases, your performance level also increases. This is shown when the graph uses a positive correlation between the arousal and performance of an athlete, because it shows that arousal levels increase when the performance levels of an athlete increases. This theory is very reliable and true for an athlete who takes part in para events, for example weightlifting. This is because they require short and explosive movements to be successful, and having a high arousal level will help with the movement to be more effective when doing it. This is because it means that the athlete would have an increase in their aggression and adrenaline, which would help them to lift the weight with much more power. However, this theory is wrong and invalid for athletes who take part in sports which require higher levels of concentration, such as an archer. This is because if the athlete had an arousal level which was really high, it can put a negative effect on their performance, as they would be less focused and would have more energy, which could cause their arm to shake, meaning that their accuracy would not be great. This example can also be used for a person who takes part in darts. Therefore, this situation shows that the Holds drive theory is invalid and incorrect. Next, we're going to go on to the inverted U hypothesis. So this theory also shows that an athlete's performance is able to be affected by the level of arousal that they have. If they have a low level of arousal, the quality of their performance will be low, and this is shown at the beginning of the inverted U on the graph. However, as their arousal increases, the curve starts to form due to it having a positive effect on the athlete's performance. The curve stops going up in the upwards direction after the athlete has reached optimum arousal and their maximum performance. However, due to their arousal level constantly increasing after it reaches optimum level, it starts to go into a high level of arousal and would cause the athlete's sporting performance to get worse. This is how the inverted U is created due to the line decreasing. This theory is known to be more reliable as it takes into consideration the phase in which an athlete can become over-aroused, which has a negative effect on their performance, whereas the drive theory has a constant increase in the athlete's performance, even when it's gone past the optimum arousal point. An example to show that this theory is valid to sport is by using a football player. At the beginning of the match, the player may have a low level of arousal, which means that they may not be going into tackles with much force, or their passes may not have much power on them, meaning that it gets intercepted. And because of these mistakes that they are making, their performance levels are low. However, because they are making mistakes, they start to get frustrated, making their arousal levels start to increase. And because of this, they start to become more focused and aware about what is going on in the game. They start to get into more tackles with more aggression and win the ball, and their passes start to become a lot more accurate and powerful. This means that their performance levels start to increase until they reach their maximum performance level and their optimum arousal level. If a player's arousal still increases, instead of their performance also increasing, it starts to gradually decrease due to it already meeting the highest level of their performance. This may mean that they start to dive into tackles and miss the ball, or maybe passing the ball with too much power, making the quality levels of their performance gradually decrease and get worse. The optimal level of arousal is the best phase to be in for an athlete when playing a sport. This is because at this level an athlete would be more focused and be more focused on what they're doing, and less likely to get distracted by the atmosphere around them. For example, 100-meter sprinter may be in the optimal level of arousal phase. This means that they wouldn't get distracted by the crowd surrounding them and would be more concentrated on the race. It makes it more likely for the athlete to get a much more better time and maybe win the race. Next, we're going to go on to complex versus simple skills. So different types of skills in a sport require different levels of arousal to make them more successful. The graph that is used shows two different types of skill, which are complex and simple. Complex skills are skills where you use small muscle groups which work together to do a movement, whereas a simple skill is a skill where we use larger and more powerful muscles to do a certain movement. The optimal arousal level for a complex skill wouldn't be as high as a simple skill because you would need to be more calm and more relaxed to perform a complex skill, and would have to be more concentrated on your technique to make it more successful, whereas a simple skill doesn't need much concentration and you wouldn't need to be focused to perform it correctly as it is a simple skill. So an example of a complex skill would be a throw in darts. This is because it requires a lot of concentration and a high level of focus to make the throw accurate. You would need to be really controlled and control the muscles which are being used, meaning that you would have to make your heart rate slower and slow down your breathing rate so that you are able to be more relaxed and you are able to perform the throw a lot more easier and to get to the optimal arousal level. An example of a simple skill could be a pass to a teammate in a football match. This is classed as a simple skill because it doesn't need much concentration to perform it, and it can easily be performed when being more aroused and less relaxed. To perform a pass with enough power to get to your teammate, if they are far away, you would need to utilise your leg muscles a lot more, which would mean you would need a much higher level of arousal. And because it is a simple skill, the higher level of arousal wouldn't really affect the performance of the athlete. Next, we're going to go on to different athletes at different levels of arousal. So different types of athletes work at their best with different levels of arousal. On the graph which is used, it shows 3 different types of athletes, which are beginners, intermediates, and elites, and it shows the contrast between all of them and their optimal level of arousal. So the graph shows that beginners would need the lowest level of arousal, intermediates would need the middle, and the elites would have the highest level of arousal. There are specific reasons for this. For a beginner, they would need low arousal levels and would have low performance levels due to them still going through the learning process and still getting used to how to play the sport correctly. At this point, they haven't developed enough to perform properly, and their knowledge of the sport wouldn't be very good, meaning that they wouldn't be able to make quick enough decisions when playing. If they experience high levels of arousal, they are more likely to become overwhelmed and not know what to do due to them not being in that situation before. For example, a beginner in football was doing a simple skill that they have been practicing, such as dribbling. They would have a low arousal level because they wouldn't be under pressure and they are able to concentrate on keeping the ball close to their feet. However, if you put a defender in to put pressure on them when they are not ready, they will start to panic and make constant mistakes because they aren't used to the skill of keeping the ball at their feet with pressure on them from another person. They would start to get more aroused and they aren't used to it, so instead they would make mistakes and want to give up because it is too much for them to handle during this part of their development. For an elite athlete, they are able to have a high arousal level due to them having previous experience and motivation. They have already passed and been through the learning process, therefore they are able to experience those high levels of arousal. When you are at an elite level or have been playing sport for a long period of time, you are used to performing the skills which are needed, meaning that you are able to cope with the high levels of arousal because you wouldn't have to think about some of the skills that you do, and they should be coming to you more automatically because you have been doing them for a long period of time. Also, an elite athlete would experience a lot of the competition, which will enable them to have those higher levels of arousal and help them to reach their optimum level of performance. For example, looking at the amount of people watching person and on TV, and also looking at the opponents that they play against, all of it helps to increase their arousal levels and for them to reach their optimum performance. The surroundings that they would have during a game would give them the motivation to perform their best. If an elite athlete increases their arousal too much and starts to become over-aroused, it would have a negative effect on their performance due to them becoming stressed and more aggressive. For example, if they become angry, they may overpower a shot which was close to the goal and hit it over the crossbar. However, if this happens, instead of them getting more frustrated, they are able to revert back to their dominant behaviour. This is due to the experience that they have had, meaning that they have had the experience of these things going bad, and they are able to correct this and forget about what mistake they made, which would reduce their arousal levels and get them back into their optimum arousal level a lot quicker. For example, if an elite football player was to become over-aroused, they may overpower a shot from a short distance away from the goal and hit it over the crossbar. Instead of reacting negatively to this, due to them having experience with making mistakes like this, they would forget about it and carry on with the game, and may be able to bounce back and score with the next shot they take.